In the shadowy corners of European finance, where whispers of wealth echo through marble halls and handwritten letters seal the fate of nations, one name has survived centuries of revolution, war, and economic upheaval: the Rothschilds, a family whose fortune is so vast, so carefully hidden, that even today, most estimates of their wealth are considered laughably conservative. But here's what might surprise you. This empire didn't begin with kings or emperors or ancient nobility. It started with a single man, living in the cramped Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, who understood something that would change the world forever. Money doesn't sleep, and neither, it seems, did he. Tonight, we're diving deep into the rise of what many consider the most powerful family in human history. A family whose influence shaped the outcome of wars, toppled governments, and created the very foundations of modern banking. And yet, for all their power, they've managed to remain largely invisible to the public eye. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've heard conspiracy theories, wild claims, exaggerated stories. But what I'm about to share with you isn't speculation. It's the documented rise of a financial dynasty that makes today's tech billionaires look like street corner vendors. We're talking about a family that at their peak controlled roughly half of the world's wealth. Half of the world's wealth. Before we begin this journey through cobblestone streets and counting houses, through battlefield communications and royal treasuries, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about information, timing, and the kind of strategic thinking that turns a single gold coin into an empire that spans continents. So settle in, because we're about to explore how 5 brothers from Frankfurt became the puppet masters of European finance, and why their influence still shapes the world you wake up to every single day. Let me take you back to Frankfurt, 1744. The city smells of coal smoke and horse manure, and in the narrow, winding streets of the Judengasse, the Jewish quarter, life moves at the pace of survival. This isn't the Frankfurt you might imagine. There are no gleaming skyscrapers or modern conveniences. Instead, picture cramped wooden buildings, their upper floors jutting out over muddy streets so narrow that neighbors could shake hands from their windows. In this world, a man named Meyer Amschel-Bauer is about to make a decision that will echo through history. But first, let's understand what he's working with. The Judengasse isn't just a neighborhood, it's a prison with invisible walls. Jews in Frankfurt face restrictions that would make your head spin. They can't own land outside the quarter. They can't join most guilds. They can't even leave the ghetto on Sundays or Christian holidays. And at night, the gates are locked, literally locked. But here's where the story gets interesting. Mayor Amschel doesn't see walls. He sees opportunity. His father had been a money changer and trader in small goods, working from a house marked with a red shield. In German, that's Rothschild. And when the young Meyer takes over the family business, he does something remarkable. He changes his name from Bauer to Rothschild, embracing that red shield as his family's banner. It's a small gesture, but it signals something profound. This isn't just about continuing a business. This is about building a legacy. Now, imagine you're Mayor Amschel in 1760. You're 26 years old, and you're staring at a problem that has defeated countless others. How do you build wealth when you're legally prohibited from participating in most of the economy? How do you expand when you can't even own property outside a few cramped streets? The answer, it turns out, lies in understanding something that most people completely miss. In the 18th century, Europe isn't really Europe as we know it. It's a patchwork of tiny kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and city-states, each with its own currency, its own rules, its own needs. And connecting these scattered pieces of political puzzle requires something that most people take for granted today. It requires trust. Mayor Amschel realizes that while he can't own land or join guilds, there's no law preventing him from becoming indispensable. And he starts with coins, not just any coins, but rare coins, ancient coins, coins that tell stories of empires and kings and forgotten battles. He begins dealing in numismatics, turning his shop into a destination for collectors and nobility who appreciate the craftsmanship of bygone eras. But here's the genius part. While his customers are admiring the artistry of Roman aureus or medieval ducats, Mayer is studying them. He's learning their languages, their customs, their financial needs. He's building relationships that go far beyond simple transactions. He's becoming a confidant, a trusted advisor, someone who understands not just the value of money, but the movement of money. And then comes the breakthrough that changes everything. Prince William of Hanau needs someone he can trust. The prince has a problem that keeps him awake at night. He's accumulated enormous wealth by renting out Hessian soldiers to other European powers. These aren't just any soldiers. These are some of the finest fighting men in Europe, and renting them out is incredibly lucrative. But here's the catch. The prince needs someone who can manage this money discreetly, someone who can move it across borders, invest it wisely, and keep it safe from the political chaos that constantly threatens to engulf Europe. Most bankers of the era are either too visible, too connected to particular governments, or simply too unreliable. But Mayor Amschel, he's perfect, he's intelligent, discreet, and because of his position in the Jewish community, he exists somewhat outside the traditional power structures that make other bankers politically vulnerable. The prince makes a decision that will reshape history. He entrusts Mayer Amschel Rothschild with managing his fortune. And just like that, a coin dealer from the Frankfurt ghetto becomes banker to royalty. But Mayer isn't content to simply manage someone else's money. He has a vision that's far more ambitious, far more revolutionary than anyone realizes. He looks at his 5 sons, Nathan, James, Karl, Salomon, and Amschel, and he sees something that no one in banking has ever attempted before. Picture this. It's the late 1700s, and communication across Europe moves at the speed of horses. A letter from London to Vienna might take weeks. Financial information moves even slower, filtered through layers of intermediaries, each adding their own delays and distortions. But what if you could create a network that moves faster than governments, faster than armies, faster than anyone else in the financial world? This is Mayer's masterpiece. He's going to send his sons to the financial capitals of Europe, not as competitors, but as extensions of a single, coordinated intelligence network. Nathan will go to London, the heart of global trade. James will establish himself in Paris, the center of continental European politics. Karl will set up operations in Naples, controlling Mediterranean finance. Salomon will position himself in Vienna, the seat of the Austrian Empire. And Amschel will remain in Frankfurt, coordinating the entire operation. Think about what this means. For the first time in history, a single family will have real-time financial intelligence across the entire European continent. They'll know about political developments before governments do. They'll understand currency fluctuations before other bankers even hear rumors. They'll have advance notice of wars, treaties, and economic disruptions that could make or break fortunes. But here's what makes this strategy absolutely brilliant. They're not just gathering information, they're creating it. Each brother becomes a major financial player in his respective city, which means they're not just observing the markets, they're influencing them. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice. It's 1815, and Napoleon has escaped from Elba. Europe is gripped by panic as the former emperor marches toward what will become the Battle of Waterloo. Governments are scrambling to understand what's happening. Stock markets are in free fall as investors try to guess the outcome of a battle that will determine the future of the continent. But the Rothschilds have something no one else has. They have a communication network that spans Europe, and they're about to use it in a way that will cement their reputation forever. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, has positioned agents throughout Europe, not just financial agents, but carriers, messengers, and informants who can move information faster than anyone imagined possible. As the battle rages at Waterloo, Nathan's network is already in motion. Here's what happens next, and this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. While London waits anxiously for news of the battle's outcome, while government officials pace in their offices wondering whether British investments are about to become worthless paper, Nathan Rothschild already knows the result. Wellington has defeated Napoleon, but Nathan doesn't immediately act on this information. Instead, he does something that demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that borders on genius. He begins selling British government bonds, heavily, publicly, in full view of other traders who respect his judgment and assume he must have inside information suggesting a British defeat. The market panics. Other investors, seeing Nathan Rothschild selling British bonds, assume the worst. They begin selling too. Prices plummet. British government securities become available at a fraction of their previous value. And then quietly, Nathan begins buying. Not through his own name, but through agents positioned throughout the London financial district. He purchases British bonds at catastrophically low prices, acquiring a massive position in what everyone assumes are worthless securities. Only then does the official news arrive. Wellington has won, Napoleon is defeated. British bonds are not only secure, they're about to become more valuable than ever. In a single day, Nathan Rothschild has multiplied his fortune several times over. But more importantly, he's demonstrated something that will define the Rothschild approach for generations to come. Information plus timing plus strategic thinking equals unprecedented power. The family's reputation spreads like wildfire through European financial circles. The Rothschilds don't just have money. They have something far more valuable in the age before telegraphs and telephones. They have information, and they know how to use it. But Waterloo is just the beginning. As Europe begins to rebuild after decades of war, as new nations emerge, and old empires adapt to changing realities, the Rothschild network expands its influence in ways that will fundamentally reshape how international finance operates. The five brothers aren't just building banks anymore, they're creating something entirely new, a financial system that transcends national boundaries, that operates according to its own rules, and that has the power to influence the fate of nations. And the most remarkable part? They're just getting started. By the 1820s, the Rothschild name carried weight that most people today simply cannot comprehend. When Nathan Rothschild walked into the London Stock Exchange, conversations stopped. When James de Rothschild attended a gathering in Paris, ministers and merchants alike sought his opinion on everything from currency fluctuations to the political stability of distant kingdoms. But here's what's truly remarkable about this period. The brothers weren't just wealthy bankers anymore. They had become something unprecedented in human history. They were a private central banking system operating across multiple nations simultaneously. Let me paint you a picture of just how revolutionary this was. Imagine you're a merchant in 1825 and you need to move money from London to Vienna to purchase goods that you plan to sell in Naples before shipping the profits back to invest in Amsterdam. In the traditional system, this would require multiple intermediaries, countless fees, weeks or months of delays, and enormous risks. Currency could fluctuate wildly during transit. Political tensions could freeze assets. Bandits could intercept shipments. The entire process was so complicated and dangerous that most merchants simply couldn't operate on an international scale. But if you worked with the Rothschilds, everything changed. Nathan in London could issue you a letter of credit that James in Paris would honor immediately. Carl in Naples could convert your profits into whatever currency you needed, while Salomon in Vienna arranged your next purchase before you even arrived. The entire transaction could happen in days instead of months, with minimal fees and virtually no risk. This wasn't just convenient, it was transformative. The Rothschilds were creating the infrastructure for modern international commerce, decades before anyone else even understood what that might look like. But their ambitions extended far beyond simple money transfers. The brothers had recognized something that would define the next century of European development. Governments were desperate for capital, but they couldn't access it efficiently. The old system of royal treasuries and court financiers was completely inadequate for the massive infrastructure projects and military expenses that emerging nation-states required. Enter the Rothschild innovation that would change everything: government bonds. Not just any government bonds, but bonds backed by the Rothschild guarantee and distributed through their international network. Here's how this worked and why it was so revolutionary. Let's say the Austrian Empire needed to raise money for railroad construction. In the old system, they might approach wealthy individuals or small banking houses, each of whom could provide limited capital and would demand enormous interest rates to compensate for the risk. The process was slow, expensive, and often unsuccessful. But with the Rothschilds, everything changed. Salomon in Vienna could negotiate directly with government officials, offering not just his own capital, but access to the entire European investor network that his brothers had cultivated. Nathan in London could sell Austrian bonds to British investors. James in Paris could market them to French financiers. Carl in Naples could distribute them throughout the Italian peninsula. Suddenly, the Austrian Empire wasn't just borrowing money from a few local sources. They were accessing capital from across the entire continent at competitive rates through a distribution system that no government had ever imagined possible. And here's the brilliant part. The Rothschilds weren't just facilitating these transactions, they were guaranteeing them. When investors purchased bonds through the Rothschild network, they weren't just betting on the creditworthiness of a particular government. They were betting on the Rothschild reputation. And by the 1820s, that reputation was worth more than most national treasuries. This created what economists today would recognize as a virtuous cycle. The more governments relied on Rothschild financing, the more essential the family became to European stability. The more essential they became, the more information they gathered about political and economic developments. The more information they possessed, the better their investment decisions. And the better their decisions, the wealthier they became. But wealth was just one dimension of their growing influence. The Rothschilds were accumulating something far more powerful than money. They were accumulating leverage over the basic functioning of European civilization. Consider what happened during the various revolutionary movements that swept across Europe in the 1830s and 1840s. When political upheaval threatened established governments, nervous investors would panic, selling securities and hoarding gold. Markets would collapse, credit would freeze, and entire economies could grind to a halt. But the Rothschilds had positioned themselves as the stabilizing force that could prevent total financial catastrophe. When the July Revolution erupted in France in 1830, it was James de Rothschild who provided the emergency financing that kept the new government operational during its first crucial weeks. When revolution threatened Austria in 1848, it was Salomon who ensured that government bond payments continued, maintaining investor confidence even as political chaos reigned in the streets. They weren't just bankers anymore. They had become the shock absorbers of the European financial system, and their influence extended into areas that most people never even considered. Take the development of railway systems, for example. Today, we think of railroads as obvious infrastructure investments, but in the 1840s, they represented enormous financial risks. The technology was unproven, the costs were astronomical, and the potential returns were completely speculative. Most investors and governments approached railway development cautiously, if at all. But the Rothschilds saw something different. They understood that railroads weren't just transportation systems. They were communication networks that would accelerate the flow of information, goods, and capital across Europe. In other words, railroads would make their existing advantages even more pronounced. So they didn't just invest in railroads, they revolutionized railroad financing. James de Rothschild didn't just fund the Northern Railway in France. He created an entirely new model for infrastructure investment that combined government guarantees with private capital and international distribution of risk. Nathan didn't just support British railway development. He pioneered the financial instruments that made massive capital projects feasible for the first time in human history. By the 1850s, the Rothschild network had become so central to European development that they were essentially partners with governments in shaping the continent's future. They weren't just responding to economic opportunities, they were creating them. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. The brothers had developed something that modern business theorists would recognize as an almost perfect information monopoly. Their communication network had evolved far beyond simple financial intelligence. They had agents, correspondents, and allies embedded throughout European society. Diplomats, merchants, journalists, and government officials all contributed to a flow of information that gave the Rothschilds unprecedented insight into political and economic developments. This intelligence network operated with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern intelligence agencies in the 20th century. The Rothschilds knew about treaty negotiations before they were announced. They understood currency policy changes before they were implemented. They could predict political upheavals before they occurred. And they used this information not just for financial gain, but to position themselves as indispensable advisors to the very governments and institutions they were financing. When European leaders needed to understand the implications of a particular policy decision, they increasingly turned to Rothschild analysis. When investors needed to assess political risks, they relied on Rothschild intelligence. The family had achieved something that no banking house had ever accomplished before. They had become simultaneously private financiers and quasi-governmental institutions. They operated with the flexibility of private enterprise, but wielded influence comparable to nation-states. By the mid-19th century, conservative estimates suggested that the Rothschild family controlled somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the world's total wealth. But even more significantly, they controlled the mechanisms through which that wealth flowed. Government financing, international trade, infrastructure development, currency exchange, virtually every aspect of the emerging global economy passed through systems that the Rothschilds had either created or heavily influenced. And yet, despite their enormous power, they maintained a level of discretion that allowed them to operate largely outside public scrutiny. Unlike monarchs or political leaders, the Rothschilds didn't need to justify their decisions to voters or parliaments. Unlike traditional merchants, they didn't depend on any single market or commodity. They had created a form of power that was both enormous and nearly invisible. The implications of this development would shape not just European finance, but global politics for generations to come. The Rothschild model had proven that private financial networks could accumulate influence that rivaled or exceeded that of traditional governments. They had demonstrated that information, properly organized and strategically deployed, could be more valuable than armies or territories. But their story was far from over. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating. New continents were opening to European influence, and the Rothschilds were positioning themselves to play a central role in developments that would reshape human civilization itself. The world was changing at a pace that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Steam engines thundered across newly laid tracks, connecting cities that had been weeks apart by horse and carriage. Telegraph wires began stretching across continents, carrying messages at the speed of lightning. And in the midst of this technological revolution, the Rothschilds recognized an opportunity that would dwarf even their previous achievements. They were about to become the financiers of the future itself. Picture this scene. It's 1869, and in a small office in London, Nathan's son Lionel is examining a proposal that most bankers would have dismissed as fantasy. A French engineer named Ferdinand de Lesseps wants to dig a canal through the desert. connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. The project would cut shipping times between Europe and Asia by months, potentially revolutionizing global trade. But it would also require more capital than most nations could raise, involve construction in one of the world's most challenging environments, and depend on political cooperation from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Most rational investors would have walked away, but Lionel Rothschild saw something different. He saw the future of international commerce, and he wanted the Rothschild name written all over it. The Suez Canal project became a perfect example of how the second generation of Rothschilds had learned to think beyond their father's already revolutionary approach. They weren't just financing governments anymore. They weren't just facilitating trade. They were investing in projects that would reshape the fundamental geography of global commerce. But here's where the story gets even more remarkable. While other investors focused on the potential profits from canal tolls, the Rothschilds understood something far more sophisticated. The Suez Canal wasn't just a shipping route. It was a choke point that would control access between the world's largest markets. Whoever controlled financing for the canal would have unprecedented leverage over international trade for generations to come. The family's investment in Suez represented a new phase in their evolution. They were no longer content to be the most powerful banking family in Europe. They were positioning themselves to become the most influential private institution in human history, and their timing couldn't have been more perfect. The 1870s brought a series of developments that would create opportunities beyond anything the original five brothers could have imagined. The American Civil War had ended, unleashing an economic boom that would transform the United States into a global industrial power. The German states were unifying under Prussian leadership, creating a new European superpower that would need massive capital for development. The British Empire was expanding into Africa and Asia, opening new markets and resources that would require unprecedented levels of financing. Each of these developments created demand for exactly the kind of sophisticated international financial services that the Rothschilds had spent decades perfecting. But they also created something else: competition. For the first time since Meyer Amschel had sent his sons across Europe, the Rothschild monopoly on international finance was facing serious challenges. American banking houses like J.P. Morgan were beginning to accumulate capital that could rival European institutions. German banks were developing their own international networks. Even some governments were beginning to establish their own central banks, reducing their dependence on private financiers. The response from the Rothschild network was swift and decisive. If they couldn't maintain their dominance through monopoly, they would maintain it through innovation. James de Rothschild in Paris pioneered what we would recognize today as investment banking, moving beyond simple lending to help corporations raise capital through sophisticated securities offerings. Nathan's successors in London developed new forms of international insurance that allowed merchants to trade in previously impossible markets. The Vienna branch created currency hedging instruments that eliminated exchange rate risks for international businesses. But perhaps their most important innovation was something that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. The Rothschilds began systematically cultivating relationships with the emerging industrial elite. They weren't just financing governments anymore. They were becoming partners with the entrepreneurs and inventors who were creating the modern world. Consider their relationship with Cecil Rhodes, the British businessman who would eventually control most of southern Africa's diamond and gold production. When Rhodes needed financing for his expansion into what would become Rhodesia, it wasn't the British government he approached first. It was the Rothschilds. They understood that Rhodes wasn't just seeking capital for mining operations. He was creating an economic empire that would generate wealth for generations. The Rothschild investment in Rhodes's ventures wasn't just financially successful, it was strategically brilliant. By the 1890s, the family controlled significant portions of the world's gold and diamond production, giving them influence over global monetary systems that went far beyond traditional banking. And they were applying this same approach across dozens of industries and continents. When oil was discovered in the Caucasus, Rothschild capital flowed into what would become some of the world's first major petroleum operations. When rubber plantations began generating enormous profits in Southeast Asia, Rothschild financing made expansion possible. When the first transcontinental railroads were being planned in the Americas, Rothschild expertise in infrastructure financing proved indispensable. By the 1880s, the family had achieved something that no private institution had ever accomplished before. They had become simultaneously bankers, industrialists, commodity traders, and infrastructure developers on a global scale. Their influence touched virtually every aspect of the emerging world economy. But this expansion came with risks that the original generation had never faced. The more visible their success became, the more attention they attracted from people who viewed their power with suspicion or hostility. Anti-Semitic movements across Europe began targeting the Rothschilds as symbols of Jewish financial influence. Nationalist politicians argued that their international network threatened national sovereignty. Socialist movements claimed they represented everything wrong with capitalism. The family's response to this growing scrutiny revealed a sophistication that matched their financial acumen. Rather than retreating from public view, they began cultivating a carefully managed public image. They became patrons of the arts, funding museums and concert halls. They supported scientific research, establishing laboratories and sponsoring expeditions. They engaged in philanthropy, building hospitals and schools throughout Europe. But these weren't just public relations exercises. The Rothschilds understood that their long-term survival depended on being perceived as beneficial to the societies in which they operated. They needed to be seen not as parasitic financiers extracting wealth from productive activities, but as essential partners in the development of modern civilization. This strategy proved remarkably effective. By the 1890s, even critics who questioned Rothschild power found it difficult to argue against Rothschild contributions to European development. The railways they had financed connected previously isolated regions. The industrial investments they had supported created employment for millions of workers. The infrastructure projects they had funded improved living standards across the continent. They had managed to transform potential liabilities into assets, turning their immense wealth into a form of soft power that complemented their financial influence. And they were about to need every advantage they could acquire. The world was approaching the 20th century, and with it would come challenges that would test everything the Rothschild network had built over more than a century of careful development. New technologies were emerging that would revolutionize communication and transportation. New political movements were gaining strength that would challenge the entire European order. New forms of warfare were being developed that would make previous conflicts seem trivial by comparison. The Rothschilds had survived and prospered through the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutions of 1848, and countless financial panics. But the approaching century would bring tests of their resilience that would make all previous challenges seem like preparation exercises. The question wasn't whether they would remain wealthy. By this point, their accumulated assets were so vast and so diversified that complete financial ruin was virtually impossible. The question was whether they could maintain their position as the world's most influential private institution in an era when governments were becoming more powerful, when public opinion was becoming more important, and when the very nature of economic power was beginning to change in fundamental ways. The family that had begun with a single coin dealer in the Frankfurt ghetto was about to discover whether the empire they had built could survive the transformation of the world itself, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Because by the dawn of the 20th century, the Rothschild network had become so deeply embedded in the global financial system that their success or failure would help determine the economic fate of nations, the outcome of wars, and the direction of human development for generations to come. They had achieved something that no family in history had ever accomplished before. But they were about to learn that with unprecedented power comes unprecedented responsibility. And with unprecedented responsibility comes unprecedented risk. The next chapter of their story would unfold against a backdrop of world wars, economic depressions, and social revolutions that would reshape human civilization. The question was whether the financial dynasty that had mastered the challenges of the 19th century could adapt quickly enough to survive the catastrophes of the 20th. Their answer would help determine not just their own fate, but the economic structure of the modern world. The year 1900 arrived with a peculiar mix of optimism and unease across European capitals. Electric lights were beginning to illuminate city streets that had known only gaslight and flame. Motor cars puttered alongside horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone roads that had witnessed centuries of empire rise and fall. And in the drawing rooms and boardrooms, where power was negotiated behind closed doors, conversations increasingly turned to a question that would have seemed absurd just decades earlier. Had the Rothschilds become too powerful for their own good? By the dawn of the 20th century, the family's wealth had reached proportions that strained comprehension. Conservative estimates placed their combine currency. To put that in perspective, that was more than their assets at over $6 billion in 1900 gross domestic product of most European nations, more than the total gold reserves of the United States Treasury, more than the combined market capitalization of every major corporation in America. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The Rothschilds had achieved something far more significant than mere accumulation of capital. They had become the invisible architecture of global finance. When governments needed to fund military campaigns, they turned to Rothschild bonds. When corporations required capital for expansion, they sought Rothschild investment. When international trade required financing, merchants relied on Rothschild letters of credit. They weren't just wealthy, they had become indispensable. Yet this indispensability was about to be tested by forces that no amount of financial engineering could control. The comfortable world of 19th century European diplomacy, where conflicts were resolved through careful negotiation and where economic interests generally aligned with political stability, was beginning to crack under pressures that would soon explode into unprecedented violence. The signs were everywhere if you knew how to read them. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II was building a naval fleet designed to challenge British maritime supremacy. In Russia, revolutionary movements were gaining strength among workers and intellectuals who viewed the existing order as fundamentally corrupt. In the Balkans, ethnic tensions were creating flashpoints that threatened to drag the great powers into conflict. And across the Atlantic, the United States was emerging as an industrial giant that would soon demand a voice in global affairs. Each of these developments posed unique challenges to the Rothschild model of international finance. Their system depended on political stability, predictable trade relationships, and the ability to maintain profitable connections with multiple governments simultaneously. But what happens when those governments begin viewing each other as existential threats? The family's response to these emerging challenges revealed both their strategic brilliance and their increasing vulnerability. Rather than choosing sides in the growing tensions between European powers, they attempted to maintain their traditional position above national politics. They continued financing all major governments, reasoning that their neutrality was their greatest asset. In London, the British branch of the family deepened their relationships with the Bank of England and the Treasury, positioning themselves as essential partners in maintaining Britain's global financial dominance. In Paris, their French cousins cultivated connections with both the established banking elite and the emerging industrial leaders who were transforming France into a modern economic power. In Vienna, they navigated the complex politics of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, balancing the competing interests of different ethnic groups and regional authorities. In Germany, they worked to establish relationships with the new industrial cartels that were driving German economic expansion. But this strategy of universal engagement was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As European powers began forming opposing alliance systems, neutrality started to look less like wisdom and more like indecision. Military leaders and nationalist politicians began questioning whether financial institutions with international loyalties could be trusted during times of national crisis. The Rothschilds found themselves facing a dilemma that would define the next phase of their evolution. Their greatest strength, their international network, was beginning to be perceived as their greatest weakness. In an era of rising nationalism and imperial competition, being citizens of everywhere meant belonging nowhere. The first major test of this new reality came sooner than anyone expected. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War erupted over competing imperial ambitions in East Asia. For the first time in modern history, a major European power was fighting a significant conflict against a non-European opponent. The financial implications were staggering, and the political ramifications were even more profound. Russia desperately needed capital to fund its military operations. But European investors were increasingly skeptical about the Tsarist regime's ability to repay its debts. The war was expensive, the Russian military was performing poorly, and revolutionary unrest was spreading throughout the empire. Under normal circumstances, the Rothschilds might have provided emergency financing to stabilize the situation, but these weren't normal circumstances. Japan, meanwhile, was seeking its own international financing to support its surprisingly effective military campaign. Here was an opportunity that demonstrated the complexity of the new global environment. Supporting Japan meant betting against Russia, one of Europe's great powers. But supporting Russia meant financing a regime that appeared increasingly unstable and militarily incompetent. The decision the Rothschilds made would have far-reaching consequences. They chose to provide significant financing to Japan, reasoning that Japanese victory was both likely and potentially profitable. It was a sound financial decision, but it was also a political statement. For the first time, the family had openly chosen sides in a conflict involving major powers. Japanese victory in 1905 validated their judgment from a purely financial perspective. Their loans to the Japanese government generated substantial profits, while investors who had supported Russia faced significant losses. But the political implications were more troubling. Russian officials and their European allies began questioning whether the Rothschilds could be trusted during future crises. Had their financial calculations compromised their political neutrality? This question became more pressing as European tensions continued to escalate. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany was consuming enormous resources and creating unprecedented demand for government financing. The Rothschilds found themselves in the impossible position of being asked to fund both sides of an escalating military competition. Their solution was characteristically sophisticated and morally ambiguous. Rather than refusing to participate in arms race financing, they developed what modern analysts would recognize as a form of financial compartmentalization. Different branches of the family would focus on different aspects of military financing, allowing them to serve multiple clients without creating obvious conflicts of interest. The London House specialized in naval financing, helping the British government fund the construction of the massive dreadnought battleships that would define modern naval warfare. The German branch focused on industrial financing, providing capital for the steel mills and armaments factories that were supplying the Kaiser's growing military machine. The French house concentrated on alliance financing, helping coordinate the financial arrangements that were binding France and Russia into an increasingly formal military partnership. On the surface, this appeared to be business as usual. The Rothschilds were simply providing financial services to their traditional clients. But underneath this facade of normalcy, something fundamental was changing. They were no longer just facilitating economic activity. They were helping to finance the instruments of potential destruction on a scale that had never been seen before, and they weren't blind to the implications. Internal family correspondence from this period reveals growing concern about the trajectory of European politics. They understood that the arms race they were helping to finance was creating a situation where even minor conflicts could escalate into continent-wide catastrophes. But they also understood that withdrawing from military financing would mean surrendering their influence over the very governments and institutions they had spent decades cultivating. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma on a global scale. Individual rationality was leading to collective irrationality, and the Rothschilds were trapped by their own success. They had become so central to European finance that they couldn't extract themselves from dangerous situations without risking the collapse of their entire network. The family's private discussions during this period reveal a level of strategic thinking that was both impressive and deeply troubling. They were planning for multiple scenarios, including the possibility of a major European war. They were diversifying their assets geographically, moving significant portions of their wealth to the United States and other regions that might remain neutral during European conflicts. They were also developing contingency plans for maintaining communication and coordination between different branches of the family, even if traditional diplomatic and commercial relationships were severed. But they were also making preparations that suggested they understood something that most political leaders were still refusing to acknowledge. The next major European conflict wouldn't be like the limited wars of the 19th century. It would be a total war that would mobilize entire societies, consume unprecedented resources, and potentially destroy the political and economic order that had allowed their empire to flourish. By 1910, the Rothschild network had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the family business that Meyer Amschel had established in Frankfurt more than a century earlier. They were no longer just bankers or even just financiers. They had become a kind of parallel government with intelligence networks that rivaled those of nation-states, financial resources that exceeded those of most countries, and influence that extended into virtually every aspect of international relations. But this evolution had come at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent. They had gained unprecedented power, but they had also accumulated unprecedented enemies. Anti-Semitic movements across Europe were using Rothschild's success as evidence of a Jewish conspiracy to control Christian nations. Nationalist politicians were arguing that their international loyalties made them inherently untrustworthy. Socialist movements were portraying them as symbols of everything wrong with capitalism. More troubling still, they were beginning to face competition from institutions that combined financial resources with governmental authority. The Federal Reserve System, established in the United States in 1913, represented a new model of central banking that could potentially challenge Rothschild dominance in international finance. Similar institutions were being developed in other countries, often with the explicit goal of reducing dependence on private financial networks. The world was changing in ways that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which the Rothschild empire had been built. The era of limited government and minimal financial regulation was ending. The age of total war and centralized economic planning was beginning, and the family that had mastered the challenges of the 19th century was about to discover whether their strategies could survive the catastrophes of the 20th. The test was coming sooner than anyone expected. In the summer of 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in the streets of Sarajevo. It seemed like a localized incident, the kind of Balkan crisis that had been resolved through diplomatic negotiation dozens of times before. But this time was different. The alliance systems that had been carefully constructed over the previous decades began activating like a series of interlocking traps. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France honored its alliance with Russia. Britain entered to protect Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, the continent was engulfed in a conflict that would consume more resources, claim more lives, and destroy more wealth than any previous war in human history. And at the center of this catastrophe, the Rothschild family faced the ultimate test of their century-long strategy. They had built an empire based on the assumption that economic interests would ultimately triumph over political passions. They had created a network designed to profit from stability and gradual change. They had positioned themselves as indispensable partners to governments that shared common interests in maintaining the international order. Now they would discover whether any of that mattered when civilization itself was tearing apart at the seams. It would come challenges that would test everything the Roths' The Great War was about to begin, and Rothschilds had learned about power, money, and survival in a world gone mad. The family that had risen from the Frankfurt ghetto to control half the world's wealth was about to learn whether their empire could survive the destruction of the world they had helped to create. The morning of August 4th, 1914, found the Rothschild family facing a crisis unlike any in their century-long history. In London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt, telegraph machines chattered incessantly as coded messages flew between family offices. The carefully constructed European order that had made their empire possible was collapsing with shocking speed, and for the first time since Mayor Amschel had sent his sons across the continent, the network faced the possibility of complete fragmentation. Nathan's grandson, Walter Rothschild, stood in the London office watching crowds gather outside the Bank of England. The British government had just declared war on Germany, and panic was spreading through the financial district like wildfire. Investors were liquidating everything they could, desperate to convert securities into gold before the currency systems collapsed entirely. But Walter wasn't thinking about immediate profits or losses. He was thinking about something far more fundamental. How do you maintain a multinational financial empire when the nations involved are trying to destroy each other? In Paris, Edmond de Rothschild was grappling with the same impossible mathematics. The French government had already begun implementing wartime financial controls, restricting currency movements and requiring approval for large transactions. His German cousins were now technically enemy aliens, and maintaining contact with them could be considered treason. The communication network that had been the family's greatest asset for nearly a century had suddenly become a potentially fatal liability. But here's what makes this moment so remarkable in the Rothschild story. Instead of panicking or retreating, they did something that demonstrated the strategic thinking that had built their empire in the first place. They adapted. Within days of the war's outbreak, the family had implemented a contingency plan that revealed months of careful preparation. Assets were rapidly redistributed to neutral territories. Communication protocols were established that could operate even under wartime censorship. Most importantly, they began positioning themselves not as obstacles to the war effort, but as essential partners in financing it. This wasn't just about survival. It was about recognizing that the Great War represented the largest financial undertaking in human history, and whoever could finance it effectively would emerge from the conflict more powerful than ever before. Consider the scale of what was happening. In previous wars, governments had funded military operations through existing treasury reserves, supplemented by relatively modest borrowing. But this conflict was consuming resources at rates that dwarfed anything in recorded history. Britain alone was spending more money per day than most countries had previously spent in entire years. France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia were all facing the same impossible challenge of funding military operations that exceeded their entire national wealth. The Rothschilds understood something that most political leaders were still struggling to grasp. This wasn't going to be a short war resolved by a few decisive battles. It was going to be a war of industrial production, where victory would go to whichever side could sustain the longest economic mobilization. And sustaining that kind of mobilization would require financial innovation on a scale that had never been attempted before. Their response was nothing short of revolutionary. Working within the constraints of wartime politics, they began developing new forms of government financing that could tap previously unimaginable sources of capital. In Britain, they helped design war bonds that could be marketed not just to wealthy investors, but to ordinary citizens who were encouraged to buy securities with their savings as a patriotic duty. The marketing campaign they developed was brilliant in its psychological sophistication. Instead of presenting war bonds as investments, they framed them as opportunities for citizens to directly participate in the defense of their homeland. Posters appeared throughout London showing soldiers in trenches with captions reading, "Your bond money bought this rifle." Children were encouraged to purchase small denomination bonds with their pocket money. Even working class families were offered payment plans that allowed them to buy war bonds through small weekly installments. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Within months, the British government had raised more capital through popular bond sales than had been raised through traditional banking channels in the entire previous century. But more importantly, the Rothschilds had demonstrated something that would reshape government financing forever. They had shown that entire populations could be mobilized as sources of capital, not just wealthy elites. This innovation wasn't limited to Britain. Working through intermediaries and neutral parties, the family helped develop similar programs in France, where war bonds were marketed as opportunities to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. In Germany, they were presented as investments in national greatness and industrial supremacy. Each campaign was tailored to local political sensibilities, but the underlying financial mechanisms were remarkably similar. By 1915, the Rothschilds had achieved something that seemed impossible just months earlier. Despite being scattered across warring nations, despite facing restrictions on international communication, despite operating under constant government surveillance, they had not only maintained their network, but had actually expanded their influence over government financing. But this success came with costs that would haunt the family for generations. Their involvement in war financing had made them targets for a new kind of criticism that went far beyond traditional anti-Semitism or concerns about foreign influence. They were now being accused of profiting from human misery on an unprecedented scale. The accusations weren't entirely unfair. The family was indeed generating enormous profits from war bonds, munitions financing, and currency speculation. Their wealth was growing even as millions of young men were dying in trenches across Europe. The contrast between Rothschild prosperity and wartime suffering created a public relations nightmare that no amount of charitable giving could completely offset. More troubling still, they were beginning to face competition from institutions that combined government authority with financial expertise. The Federal Reserve System in the United States was demonstrating that central banks could mobilize capital just as effectively as private networks, but with the added advantage of government backing and democratic legitimacy. The writing was on the wall. The era of private financial empires operating independently of government control was ending. The future belonged to institutions that could combine financial resources with political authority. The Rothschilds could either adapt to this new reality or risk becoming irrelevant. Their response revealed the same strategic flexibility that had allowed Meyer Amschel to transform a coin-dealing business into a continental empire. Instead of fighting the trend toward government-controlled finance, they began positioning themselves as indispensable partners to the emerging central banking systems. In Britain, they deepened their relationships with the Treasury and the Bank of England, offering their international expertise in exchange for preferred access to government bond issues. In France, they helped design the financial mechanisms that would allow the country to rebuild after the war ended. Even in the United States, they began cultivating relationships with Federal Reserve officials and Treasury Department leaders who would shape American financial policy for decades to come. But their most important adaptation was something that wouldn't become fully apparent until years later. They began systematically shifting their focus from government financing toward private industrial investment. If central banks were going to dominate government bond markets, the Rothschilds would dominate the financing of private enterprise. This strategic pivot proved remarkably prescient. The war was accelerating technological development at unprecedented rates. Aviation, chemical production, electronics, petroleum refining, and dozens of other industries were evolving from experimental curiosities into major economic sectors. Each of these emerging industries required exactly the kind of sophisticated international financing that the Rothschilds had spent decades perfecting. By 1916, while public attention remained focused on their role in government war financing, the family was quietly building positions in what would become the defining industries of the 20th century. They were financing aircraft manufacturing companies that would eventually become Boeing and Lockheed. They were investing in chemical firms that would develop into modern pharmaceutical giants. They were funding oil exploration companies that would discover some of the world's largest petroleum reserves. Most importantly, they were applying the same international coordination that had made them dominant in government finance to the challenge of industrial development. A Rothschild-financed steel mill in Pennsylvania could supply raw materials to a Rothschild-financed munitions factory in Birmingham, which could sell its products to governments financed through Rothschild bond issues. They were creating vertically integrated economic networks that spanned continents and industries. But even as they successfully adapted to wartime conditions, the family was facing a challenge that threatened their long-term survival more than any government policy or economic disruption. They were running out of Rothschilds. The original five brothers had produced dozens of children, but as the family had grown wealthier and more established, birth rates had declined. Many family members had chosen to marry outside the Jewish community, diluting the religious and cultural bonds that had held the network together. Others had decided to pursue careers in politics, academia, or the arts, rather than continuing the family banking tradition. By the second decade of the 20th century, there were fewer active Rothschild bankers than at any time since the 1790s. The network that had once been held together by blood relationships and shared cultural identity was increasingly dependent on professional managers and outside partners who lacked the family's historical commitment to the enterprise. This demographic challenge was compounded by generational changes in attitude and priorities. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original brothers had grown up in an era of unprecedented wealth and social acceptance. They had never experienced the restrictions and persecutions that had motivated their ancestors to build an international financial empire. For many of them, the family business was simply one option among many, not a sacred trust that had to be preserved at all costs. The implications of this generational shift became apparent in family meetings during the war years. Younger Rothschilds were increasingly questioning whether the family's traditional approach to banking was compatible with their personal values and political beliefs. Some were troubled by the family's role in financing military conflicts. Others were concerned about growing public criticism of wealth inequality and financial manipulation. Most significantly, many younger family members were attracted to the idea of using their wealth for social reform rather than simply accumulating more capital. They wanted to be remembered as philanthropists and public servants, not as financial manipulators who had profited from human suffering. This internal tension came to a head in 1917 when the Russian Revolution eliminated one of the family's most important government clients and sent shockwaves through European financial markets. The Rothschilds had been major creditors to the Tsarist regime, and the Bolshevik victory threatened to wipe out investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the financial losses were less important than the political implications. The Russian Revolution represented the first successful challenge to the entire system Rothschild's embo of private capital and international finance that they need. Lenin and his followers weren't just rejecting specific policies or demanding better terms. They were rejecting the fundamental legitimacy of private wealth accumulation and international financial networks. The Bolshevik propaganda campaigns specifically targeted the Rothschilds as symbols of capitalist exploitation and Jewish financial conspiracy. They published detailed accounts of Rothschild investments in Russian industry, framing them as evidence of foreign economic domination. They encouraged workers in Rothschild-financed factories to seize control of their workplaces as part of the broader revolutionary program. For the first time since their rise to prominence, the Rothschilds found themselves facing an ideological challenge that couldn't be resolved through financial negotiation or political compromise. The Bolsheviks weren't interested in better terms or higher interest rates. They wanted to eliminate private banking entirely and replace it with state-controlled economic planning. This challenge was particularly troubling because it wasn't limited to Russia. Socialist and communist movements throughout Europe were gaining strength, partly in response to the massive casualties and economic disruptions of the war. Workers who had been told they were fighting for democracy and national honor were beginning to question why they were dying to protect a system that seemed to benefit only the wealthy elite. The Rothschilds' response to this ideological challenge revealed both their adaptability and their limitations. They began funding anti-communist political movements and publications throughout Europe, reasoning that their long-term survival depended on defeating ideologies that threatened private property and international finance. But they also recognized that simple opposition wouldn't be sufficient. They needed to demonstrate that private financial networks could contribute to social welfare and economic development in ways that government planning could not. They needed to become part of the solution to the social problems that were fueling revolutionary movements. This realization led to what historians would later recognize as the beginning of modern corporate social responsibility. The Rothschilds began systematically investing in projects that generated not just financial returns, but measurable social benefits. They funded hospitals, schools, and research institutions. They provided capital for housing developments that improved living conditions for working-class families. They supported agricultural improvement programs that increased food production and rural prosperity. Most importantly, they began framing these investments not as charitable activities, but as essential components of a sustainable economic system. They argued that private capital could address social problems more efficiently than government bureaucracies, and that international financial networks were necessary for coordinating complex development projects across national boundaries. This strategy proved remarkably effective in countering socialist criticism. By 1918, even some left-wing publications were acknowledging that Rothschild investments had contributed to social progress and economic development. The family had successfully repositioned themselves from parasitic financiers to productive partners in building modern industrial society. But their greatest challenge was still ahead. The war was finally ending, and the peace negotiations would determine not just the fate of nations, but the structure of the international economic system for generations to come. The Rothschilds had survived the conflict and adapted to wartime conditions, but could they maintain their influence in whatever new order emerged from the ruins of European civilization? The answer would depend on decisions made in conference rooms in Paris and London, where diplomats and politicians were preparing to redraw the map of Europe and establish new institutions for international cooperation. The family that had risen to power by understanding the flow of information and capital was about to discover whether their expertise was still relevant in a world where governments wielded unprecedented economic authority. The stakes couldn't have been higher, because the post-war settlement wouldn't just determine territorial boundaries and reparation payments. It would establish the fundamental rules governing international finance, trade, and investment for the remainder of the 20th century. And those rules would determine whether the Rothschild Empire could survive the transition from the age of private financial networks to the era of government-controlled economic planning. The family that had begun with a single coin dealer in Frankfurt was about to face their ultimate test of adaptation and survival. Their response would help determine not just their own fate, but the balance of power between private capital and government authority that would define the modern world. The armistice bells had barely stopped ringing across Europe when representatives from 32 nations gathered in the opulent halls of Versailles. Outside, the gardens still bore scars from 4 years of war, abandoned trenches that had been hastily filled, sections of lawn where temporary hospitals had stood. But inside the palace, diplomats in mourning coats and military uniforms were engaged in negotiations that would reshape not just political boundaries, but the very foundations of global finance. And watching from the shadows, sometimes literally present, in adjacent rooms, sometimes represented by carefully placed intermediaries, the Rothschild network was fighting for its survival. The challenge they faced was unlike anything in their century-long history. Previous crises had threatened their profits or their political relationships. This threatened their entire model of operation. The war had demonstrated that governments could mobilize resources on scales that dwarfed private capital. Central banks had proven they could coordinate international finance without relying on private networks. Most troubling of all, public opinion was turning against the very idea of unaccountable private power. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris with a vision of international cooperation based on democratic principles and government-to-government relationships. He spoke openly about the need to eliminate secret diplomacy and private financial manipulation from international affairs. When he talked about making the world safe for democracy, he wasn't just referring to political systems. He was envisioning an economic order where elected governments, not private financiers, would control the flow of capital and credit. The British delegation, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, carried instructions that reflected similar concerns. The war had demonstrated Britain's dependence on American financial support, and British leaders were determined to establish institutions that could reduce their reliance on private banking networks. They wanted to create government-controlled mechanisms for international lending and currency stabilization. Even the French, who had traditionally been more comfortable with private financial power, were reconsidering their approach. The devastation of northeastern France required reconstruction investments that exceeded anything private capital could provide. Georges Clemenceau's government was already planning massive public works programs that would be funded through government bonds and administered through state agencies. For the Rothschilds, these developments represented an existential threat disguised as policy discussions. If the peace settlement established new international institutions based on government-to-government cooperation, what role would remain for private financial networks? If reconstruction financing flowed through official channels rather than private banks, how could they maintain their influence over European development? Their response revealed the same strategic brilliance that had allowed them to navigate the Napoleonic Wars more than a century earlier. Instead of opposing the creation of new international institutions, they positioned themselves as indispensable partners in designing them. Walter Rothschild in London began cultivating relationships with British Treasury officials who were planning the new League of Nations financial apparatus. He offered the family's century of experience in international currency management as a resource for stabilizing exchange rates in the post-war period. Rather than competing with government institutions, he proposed complementary roles where private expertise could support official policies. In Paris, Edmond de Rothschild took a different approach. He began documenting the family's contributions to French economic development, creating detailed analyses that demonstrated how private investment had accelerated industrialization and infrastructure development. His argument was subtle but powerful. Government institutions might be able to mobilize capital, but they lacked the expertise and flexibility needed for complex international projects. The German branch faced the most difficult challenge. The Weimar Republic was struggling with hyperinflation, political instability, and massive reparation payments that threatened to destroy the German economy entirely. Max Warburg, who had married into the Rothschild network, found himself navigating between German desperation and Allied demands for payment. His solution was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than simply providing emergency financing to the German government, he began developing what would later be recognized as the first modern debt restructuring programs. Working with American banks and British financial institutions, he created mechanisms that could reduce Germany's reparation burden while ensuring that Allied nations received sufficient compensation to rebuild their economies. But the family's most important innovation during this period was something that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. They began systematically shifting their focus from government financing toward what we would now recognize as multinational corporate development. From the cramped streets of the Frankfurt ghetto to the marble halls of global finance, the Rothschild story reveals something profound about power, adaptation, and survival. This wasn't just a family that got rich. This was a family that understood something fundamental about the architecture of civilization itself. They recognized that information moves faster than armies, that trust transcends borders, and that the ability to coordinate across nations could reshape the world. Today, while governments control the levers of monetary policy and central banks dominate international finance, the Rothschild influence persists in forms both visible and invisible. Their model of global coordination, their understanding of risk and opportunity, their ability to think in generations rather than quarters, continues to echo through the corridors of power. The family that began with a single red shield in Frankfurt had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had proven that private networks, built on trust and maintained through adaptability, could survive the rise and fall of empires. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of their legacy. In a world that increasingly belongs to governments and institutions, to algorithms and bureaucracies, the Rothschild name reminds us that individual vision and family commitment can still move mountains. The question isn't whether they remain the richest family in history. The question is whether we've learned the lessons they spent centuries teaching about the true nature of power in a connected world.